What if everything depended on who told the story? One gospel says salvation comes through betrayal, not just any betrayal, but the ultimate one. Another says salvation comes through hidden knowledge whispered to a woman the church tried to forget. Judas, Mary. Two names, two gospels, two radically different blueprints for redemption. One cast out for handing Jesus over, the other silenced for understanding him too well. What if they weren't wrong, just inconvenient? Let that settle for a moment. The idea that salvation was never singular, never clean. That behind the polished tales are shadows, rough, ancient, and too wild to canonize. If you listen closely, those shadows still speak. And tonight you'll hear what they've been trying to say for centuries. It begins, as many dangerous things do in the desert. Not the kind with sun-drenched dunes stretching to the horizon, but the brittle, bone-colored limestone shelves of Egypt's Upper Nile. That's where the Gospel of Judas surfaced, hidden for nearly 700 years inside a cave, waiting in silence, waiting for someone to ask the wrong questions. And in a different desert, the one between memory and myth, another voice waited too, Mary's. Her gospel didn't come with trumpets or a publisher's push. It came as a whisper through fragmented papyrus lines, missing but meaning unmistakable. She saw, she understood, and then they erased her. The early church didn't build its house on neutral ground. It built on choices, brutal, brilliant political choices. It chose 4 gospels, gave them gold trim and pulpits, and called the rest heresy. But what got left out wasn't nonsense. It was competition. That's where this story lives, not in the margins, but in the spaces they tried to seal shut. Judas Iscariot, forever infamous as the traitor hanging from a tree, 30 silver coins clinking like punctuation. But in his own gospel, he's not the villain. He's the only one who understands the plan. The only one Jesus trusts to carry out the hardest part. What kind of salvation needs betrayal and Mary Magdalene, not the weeping penitent of Sunday sermons, but a teacher, a leader, maybe even the rightful successor? In her gospel, she comforts the male disciples with a vision of the soul's ascent, a mystic map through heavenly realms straight to union with the divine. No cross, no blood, just light. These aren't bedtime stories the church wanted you to hear, but maybe that's exactly what they are now. Quiet, haunting, sacred in their own broken way. And no, this isn't a debate between orthodoxy and conspiracy. We're not going to say the Vatican has a vault with Judas's journal next to an alien fossil. Well, not yet. But we are going to read between the lines of scripture, of history, of the agendas scrawled in the margins. Because these gospels aren't just relics. They're roadmaps to 2 different kinds of salvation, one earned through transcending the material world, and one demanded through sacrifice and divine orchestration. You might not walk away with answers, but you'll never hear salvation the same way again. So before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You didn't expect the pages to look like that. Not golden, not glowing, not even pristine. Just crumbling scraps of papyrus edges frayed like dried leaves, ink faded and fragile under the weight of centuries. No heavenly choir. Just a plastic bag in a safety deposit box, mold, bugs, and yet someone whispered, this might be it. The Gospel of Judas was found not in a cathedral or a curated museum archive, but in a desert cave near El Minya, Egypt, sometime in the 1970s, though pinning down the exact year is like trying to date a ghost. The codex it came in also included a letter of Peter to Philip I, Apocalypse of James, and a random bit of Scythian cosmology. Not exactly Sunday school material. And once it was found, it didn't go straight to a scholar's desk. It went on a little adventure, stolen, smuggled, sold, frozen, forgotten. At one point, someone kept it in a bank vault in Long Island, because that's apparently where lost gospels hang out when they're not busy rewriting Christian history. Meanwhile, the Gospel of Mary had its own journey, more modest, but no less strange. The most complete version comes from a 5th century papyrus codex, purchased in Cairo in 1896 by a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt. It sat in a Berlin museum for decades before anyone even seriously translated it. And even now, it's a mystery stitched together from fragments. Of the original text, only about 8 of its 19 pages survive in that main manuscript. The rest is gone lost to fire rot, or maybe just time deciding to keep some secrets to itself. But what remains speaks volumes. Judas's gospel flips the narrative. It describes a laughing Jesus, one who mocks the other disciples for worshiping the wrong God. A Jesus who tells Judas he will exceed them all because he alone dares to betray the body so the spirit may be set free. It's not the gospel of a villain. It's the gospel of a necessary evil recast as sacred duty. Mary's gospel, on the other hand, is less theatrical, but no less revolutionary. It's soft-spoken, a meditative dialogue between Mary and the disciples after Jesus departs. The men are shaken. Peter doubts her. Levi defends her. And Mary shares a vision not of wrath or judgment, but of ascent. The soul moves through layered heavens, overcoming fear, desire, ignorance. Redemption doesn't come by blood, but by knowledge and letting go. Try pitching that to a medieval bishop and see how fast you get excommunicated. What's striking beyond the theological whiplash is the fact that both texts even survived. The campaigns to destroy them were thorough. Manuscripts were burned, buried, or recycled into mundane uses. The miracle isn't just that they were written, it's that they were found, resurrected, brought back by accidents looters and a few scholars who looked at some papyrus mulch and said there's something here. And still, neither gospel is whole. Large gaps remain. Sentences end abruptly. Pages are missing, which, depending on your level of paranoia, either points to natural decay or deliberate removal. Some claim the Gospel of Judas was damaged by those trying to protect it. Others suggest that parts were too scandalous, even for smugglers to stomach. As for Mary's Gospel, one of the most heartbreaking moments is watching her vision simply stop mid-thought, cut off by the torn edge of a page. Almost like someone didn't want us to hear the end. This partialness creates a strange intimacy. You're not reading a polished doctrine. You're eavesdropping on a buried memory. The cracks become part of the message. They remind you that this isn't just theology. It's survival. And then comes the inevitable debate. Are they real? Are they forgeries? Are they authentic expressions of early Christian diversity or later Gnostic propaganda dressed in apostolic robes? The academic community split down the middle faster than Peter and Paul in a theological knife fight. Some scholars embraced the texts as vital pieces of the puzzle. Others called them spiritual fan fiction. And still they lingered, defying easy categorization, refusing to go quietly. Both Gospels raise the same unsettling question: who decided which voices deserved to survive? It wasn't just about theology. It was about power. About who got to stand in the pulpit and who got buried in a cave. Judas and Mary weren't just inconvenient. They were threats. One offered a gospel where betrayal is divine service. The other a gospel where enlightenment renders hierarchy useless. If you're building a centralized church, neither of those plays well with your donors. And yet here they are. Read aloud, translated, reprinted, analyzed in podcasts and whispered about in seminaries. Their voices once lost are now impossible to ignore. Faint, yes, like echoes in catacombs, but clear enough to challenge the silence. Which brings you back to that image, a crumbling manuscript in a humid bank vault. Mold creeping across the pages, light flickering over ancient ink, and someone somewhere daring to ask, what if this is real? You can feel it before you even read the words. The air changes, the rooms shift. When you enter the Gospel of Mary, you step into something warm but wounded, an atmosphere of post-trauma intimacy, of quiet conversation in the ashes of everything they thought they understood. When you open the Gospel of Judas, it's not like that. You fall headfirst into a cold, cosmic geometry. The tone is razor-edged, detached, echoing with laughter that might not be kind. It's less a dialogue and more a test, like walking into a classroom and realizing the professor is actually an archon with homework that determines your soul's final destination. These Gospels were never meant for the same room. You can feel it in their bones. Mary's Gospel opens like a healing circle. The disciples have just witnessed the resurrection, and they're shattered, confused, directionless, afraid. And then Mary steps in. She speaks not with fire or thunder, but with calm, with clarity. She tells them about what Jesus revealed to her privately. Not instructions for an empire, but something far less tangible, visions of ascent, internal struggle, liberation, through detachment. It's theology whispered like bedtime philosophy. Judas's gospel is a courtroom, or maybe a trap. There's no post-resurrection comfort here. No camaraderie, no soft-edged soul work. Instead, Jesus laughs not out of joy, but irony. He tells Judas the others don't understand him, that they worship the wrong God, that their sacrifices are meaningless. He speaks of aeons, star worlds, angelic rulers who trap souls in flesh. It's not comfort Judas receives, it's burden. He must betray the physical body so that the divine spark can escape. And yes, Jesus thanks him, but not without a disturbing sense that Judas is being used, handed a cosmic poison pill wrapped in flattery. The settings reflect the audiences. Mary's Gospel seems aimed at a close-knit, spiritually curious group, trying to make sense of loss, not loss in the melodramatic sense, but loss of direction. You get the sense it was copied by people with candlelight and calloused fingers, passing it between households, between women and men who needed something more nourishing than decree. It's human. It's subtle. It meets you where you are. Judas's Gospel, that's another story. It reads like it's written for an audience already halfway into Gnostic cosmology, people who've been decoding metaphysical crossword puzzles and are ready for the advanced course. It doesn't pause to explain who Barbelo is or why the stars matter. It assumes you know the system and are ready to see behind the curtain. The tone is condescending, but with purpose, like a secret society member testing whether you're worthy of the next scroll. This difference in tone also reveals something deeper. They don't just describe different messages. They describe different Jesuses. Mary's Jesus is patient, emotionally attuned, intimately concerned with the inner world. He gives private instruction, not to elevate her above others, but to help her help them. Judas's Jesus is something else entirely. Laughing, alien, unsettling. Almost as if he's halfway out the door to the pleroma already. He mocks the disciples, but not because he hates them, because he sees how trapped they are. Judas is the only one who can take the knife to the illusion. And the settings stretch beyond time and place. Mary's Gospel is set after the resurrection, yet it feels like it's taking place in a still-burning moment among friends inside wounds with the future uncertain. Judas's Gospel plays out in an earlier moment, but outside of chronology altogether, a metaphysical chessboard, where time isn't linear and nothing is what it seems. Mary's world is one of healing the soul. Judas's world is one of escaping the simulation. This split also raises a question that still haunts the edges of modern theology. Is salvation about inner transformation, or about participating in something larger than yourself even if you never understand it? Mary's version says you ascend by understanding, by letting go, by rising through knowledge. Judas's says you ascend by breaking the system, by being the knife that separates spirit from flesh, no matter the cost. Both involve suffering, but one is redemptive, the other is sacrificial. There's also a strange echo in how each gospel treats community. In Mary's text, community is fragile but vital. Peter's resistance to Mary's authority threatens it. Levi's defense restores it. The entire arc depends on whether the group will allow a woman to lead, and in doing so, whether they will survive. In Judas's text, the community is a backdrop, a group dismissed as irrelevant. The real drama is between two minds, two visions, and one terrible choice. And yet both Gospels are haunted by the same underlying theme: what happens when the truth is given to someone the others refuse to accept. Mary is dismissed because she is a woman. Judas is reviled because he is the betrayer. Both are outsiders. Both are entrusted with a revelation that shatters the group's comfort. And both, in their own ways, are punished for it. So as you sit with these texts side by side, two questions emerge: not just who was right, but who were these written for? Were they guides for the faithful, or warnings for the curious? Were they invitations, or traps? There's no answer. But the scrolls still speak, and their voices couldn't be more different. You're in the room with them now, the disciples, not the triumphant apostles of stained glass and legend, but tired, uncertain men sitting in a circle after everything's come undone. Jesus is gone. Again. And they're left with questions. Fear. Doubt. You can almost smell the damp stone walls, feel the flicker of lamplight against their faces. And then Mary speaks. Not with fire, not with thunder, but with something stranger: authority. In the Gospel of Mary, this moment isn't just a conversation. It's a crisis. The kind that shows you who you really are. The male disciples, reeling after Jesus' departure, are paralyzed. Not physically, spiritually. Their understanding of the world has collapsed and no one knows what comes next. That's when Mary steps in. She reminds them of what Jesus told her privately: not to elevate herself, but to steady the group. It's an act of leadership clothed in gentleness. But gentleness isn't always welcome. Peter immediately questions her, not just what she says, but whether she had the right to receive any teaching at all. You can hear the suspicion in his voice. Did he really speak with a woman in private and not openly to us? Are we to turn and all listen to her? The implication isn't subtle. Peter isn't just doubting the message. He's doubting her right to bear it. And that's where the text does something remarkable. It doesn't defend Mary with miracles or rebukes. It lets another disciple, Levi, answer Peter, not with anger, but reason. Levi says, in essence, if the Savior found her worthy, who are we to reject her? And then he urges the others to preach the gospel without setting any more rules. The text ends not with a doctrinal statement, but with a question of trust, a subtle, unresolved note. Almost like history was waiting to see which path the church would take. This dynamic, Mary's voice rising in a moment of male confusion, then being challenged and defended, echoes something very old and very human. It's the tension between experience and institution, between the person who knows because they've lived it and the person who rules because they were given the keys. Mary has the former, Peter the latter. And the gospel quietly asks, which is more important? It's also where the gospel of Mary departs from the others. In the canonical Gospels, Mary is present at the tomb at the foot of the cross, even receiving the news of the resurrection before anyone else. But she doesn't preach. She doesn't explain. In this text, she does. Not only does she teach, she reveals a vision of the soul's journey through the heavens, shedding attachments, confronting cosmic forces, moving toward divine rest. It's a mysticism that's internal fluid and deeply individual, not dogma, but direction. And the tone, it's gentle but firm. Her vision doesn't rely on thunderclaps or prophetic wrath. It unfolds like silk layer by layer, guiding the listener rather than commanding them. It's not a gospel of laws. It's a gospel of liberation. This makes her dangerous. Because authority in early Christianity was becoming centralized, not just around texts, but around people. Apostolic succession, male leadership, public teachings. And Mary, with her private visions and quiet clarity, didn't fit the mold. She offered a kind of leadership that didn't require hierarchy, a spiritual authority that flowed from inner knowledge, not outer rank. And in a world building toward bishops and councils, that kind of authority had no place. You start to wonder not just about what Mary said, but about who decided not to let her say more. Why is this gospel fragmentary? Why are entire pages missing from every version we've found? Did the copyists lose them? Did time erode them, or did someone decide that too much Mary was simply too much? There's a scholarly debate here simmering beneath the parchment. Some argue the Gospel of Mary reflects a real faction in early Christianity, one that saw women not just as followers, but as transmitters of divine wisdom. Others say it's a later Gnostic invention, projecting mysticism onto a familiar figure to gain legitimacy. But either way, the fact that Mary was chosen as the voice of this revelation matters. They could have picked anyone. They picked her. And this choice does something extraordinary. It reframes the old narrative of betrayal and redemption. Instead of sin and sacrifice, we're offered understanding and release. Mary isn't redeemed because of repentance. She's respected because of her insight. In a religion that would later turn confession into currency that's nothing short of subversive. This also recalls Judas's gospel in its own twisted way. Just as he's given a revelation the others can't understand, so is she. Just as he's separated from the group by a divine calling, so is she. But where Judas's gospel ends in isolation and doom, Mary's holds the possibility of reconciliation. It asks whether the community can accept a truth that came in the wrong package. And you already know the answer history gave. Mary disappears. Her gospel vanishes. Her leadership is buried beneath centuries of misidentification, turned into a prostitute, a sinner, a footnote. And yet here she is, still speaking, still teaching. A voice carved into scraps of papyrus carried across continents, lost and found again. So now when you hear her speak, you don't just hear theology. You hear resistance. You hear grace with a backbone. And maybe you hear the kind of authority that doesn't need a throne. The first thing that hits you is the laughter. Not yours, not Judas's. It's Jesus, and he's laughing. Not because something's funny, but because something's tragic, or ironic. Or perhaps in the strange universe of the Gospel of Judas, inevitability is the only real punchline. You've seen Judas before, hunched in shame, coin purse in hand, head bowed beneath centuries of contempt. But not here. Here in this gospel, he's something else, entirely trusted, chosen, and damned by design. His betrayal isn't a slip or a sin. It's a mission, a cosmic favor, the key that unlocks the next stage of salvation, which is a bit like saying the fire was chosen to liberate the statue inside the wax. The Gospel of Judas opens mid-conversation, mid-paradox. Jesus is already mocking the other disciples. He tells them they're sacrificing animals to a lesser god. They think they understand divinity, but they're just reenacting ignorance. They worship Yaldabaoth, a demiurge, not the true Father. Theirs is a religion of smoke and noise. Judas, however, sees something more, and Jesus sees him. There's a strange intimacy in how Jesus speaks to Judas. He tells him that he will exceed all of them, that he will offer up Jesus' body in sacrifice, and yes, that he will be cursed for it. But not because he failed, because he succeeded. Judas becomes the hinge of a secret plan, not the villain, but the executor of divine logic. His betrayal is framed as necessary for release. Jesus must die so the divine spark can ascend, and Judas must be the one to start the engine. It's deeply uncomfortable, because in this telling, the entire framework of guilt, sin, repentance, all the theological currency that's been passed down for centuries, is flipped. Judas isn't the fall guy. He's the only one who understands the assignment. He doesn't sell Jesus out for money or revenge. He does it because he's been asked to, because the system itself needs breaking. The betrayal isn't a sin. It's a cosmic jailbreak, and the weight of it crushes him. This is not a story where Judas walks away with a smug grin. This is a story of someone being asked to bear the unbearable, not just the act, but the knowledge. He is told in one of the Gospel's most haunting lines that he will grieve more than all the others. It's not heroism. It's sacrifice of a different kind, the sacrifice of legacy, of name, of peace. This isn't a free pass for treachery, by the way. It's not a theological loophole where stabbing your friends gets you a medal. The gospel doesn't make Judas noble in the way we like our heroes to be. It just makes him necessary. Which in some ways is worse. It's one thing to fall. It's another to be told you must jump, and that no one will ever believe why. There's an echo here, perhaps, even a deliberate contrast with Mary's gospel. Where she is chosen to bring understanding and peace, Judas is chosen to bring rupture and pain. She receives a vision that heals. He receives a vision that burns, and neither is accepted by the others. Peter doubts Mary. The disciples revile Judas. Both carry secrets. Only one is celebrated, and it's not him. This leads into an open scholarly wound, the question of authorship and intent. Was this gospel written by a sect that truly honored Judas? Or is this a literary inversion, a provocation meant to highlight the absurdity of institutional religion? The text's tone is so cold, so riddled with esoteric terminology, that some argue it's a satire. Others say it reflects a serious cosmological worldview, one in which the material world is a prison and betrayal of the body is the only way to liberation. And yet, it's the specificity of Judas's role that makes it unforgettable. He's not just a betrayer. He is the betrayer. Singular, foretold, pre-approved. It's almost surgical, a divinely sanctioned cut to release the soul. Jesus even tells him that the star of his spirit will lead the way. You don't give that kind of prophecy to just anyone. This transforms the whole narrative of passion and crucifixion. It reframes Jesus' death not as a martyrdom at the hands of evil, but as a planned detonation, one in which Judas is the button. The horror isn't in the betrayal, it's in the clarity. Of course, this raises a question that still smolders beneath centuries of Christian theology. Can someone be guilty for doing what they were predestined to do? If Judas was chosen to betray, then is the betrayal even his? If Jesus needed him to ascend, then was his role a curse or a calling? The Gospel of Judas doesn't answer. It doesn't comfort. It presents a Jesus who is distant and divine, a cosmic intelligence playing 13-dimensional chess. Judas is a knight on the board, expendable essential, and always moving toward a sacrifice. And you can't help but wonder, what if he knew? What if in those final moments, coin in hand, lips pressed to a cheek, he wasn't falling, but fulfilling? It doesn't make the story easier to hear, but it does make it impossible to forget. You might picture the early church as a group of bearded men in sandals gathered in dusty rooms, peacefully deciding the fate of theology over bread and wine. The truth is closer to a bar fight with scrolls, competing visions, personal feuds, secret alliances, and underneath it all, a question that would decide everything: who gets to define salvation. The church didn't emerge fully formed. It clawed its way out of chaos. In the first 2 centuries after Jesus' death, the landscape of Christianity resembled a marketplace of revelations. There were gospels attributed to Peter, Thomas, Mary, Judas, Philip, even ones that gave the childhood years of Jesus a magical twist, complete with petulant miracles and divine mood swings. Belief systems ranged from earthy and communal to dizzyingly esoteric, mapping entire universes filled with archons, emanations, and secret passwords for the afterlife. And in the middle of all this confusion was a small, splintering group of followers desperately trying to forge something coherent, something durable. You can feel this tension in the way voices like Mary and Judas were treated. Their gospels weren't destroyed immediately. They were tolerated, briefly, discussed, circulated, but they were never embraced by the growing power centers of the church. Their visions of salvation, one rooted in inner knowledge, the other in preordained betrayal, clashed violently with what was becoming orthodoxy. Salvation, the mainstream church insisted, must come through the body of Christ and through faith in that body's death and resurrection. No shortcuts, no secret knowledge, no backroom revelations whispered to women or traitors. And this is where the politics begin to whisper through the parchment. Take Peter and Mary. In the Gospel of Mary, Peter explicitly questions her authority. He doubts that Jesus would have spoken privately to a woman. It's not subtle, it's a direct reflection of early community tensions. Mary represents an experiential, mystical path. Peter represents structure, doctrine, and emerging institutional control. It's not just a disagreement, it's a proxy war for the soul of the faith. Likewise, the Gospel of Judas strikes at the very foundation of emerging Christian ritual. In the text, Jesus mocks the disciples for sacrificing to the wrong God, suggesting that their acts of worship are meaningless, even blasphemous. That's not just theological sass. That's a shot across the bow of everything the proto-church was building. If the Eucharist, the liturgy, the gathering of believers in sacred community is misguided, then what is the church even for? So one by one, the voices that didn't fit began to be pushed aside. Not always burned, not always banned. Sometimes just left off the recommended reading list. The canon wasn't formed all at once. It was more of a slow, quiet purge. Documents were copied less often, mentioned less frequently. And slowly, deliberately, they disappeared from the conversation. In a world where everything was hand-copied, being ignored was a death sentence. And yet there's something almost tragic about how close it was. For a brief flickering moment, other Gospels had their chance. The Gospel of Mary was quoted by some early Christian thinkers. The ideas behind the Gospel of Judas weren't unique. They were part of a wider Gnostic tapestry that was being woven all across the Mediterranean. But eventually, the church picked its threads, not because they were the only ones available, but because they offered unity, structure, power. Because let's be honest, a religion that depends on secret knowledge, mystical visions, or the divine necessity of betrayal doesn't scale very well. It's hard to build an empire on ambiguity. Much easier to say, believe this, do this, say this prayer, eat this bread, follow this bishop, and you're in. Simplicity wins converts. Clarity builds cathedrals. There's a callback here to the earlier Gospels we've examined. Mary's Gospel asks its followers to transcend material attachments, to rise through knowledge and internal transformation. Judas's Gospel asks one man to destroy the material altogether on behalf of something greater. Both are inward journeys, and both are frankly bad PR for a religion trying to plant its flag across continents. This isn't to say the early church leaders were cynical, though some certainly were. Many genuinely believed they were protecting the truth, that they were building a house where faith could survive the storms. But in doing so, they made choices. Some stories were canonized, others were forgotten. And in the shadows of those choices, the battle for the first church was won not with swords or miracles, but with silence. There's a reason most believers today have never heard of these alternative gospels. It's not because they weren't important. It's because they lost. And history, as it turns out, is remarkably good at writing obituaries for voices it no longer wishes to hear. So the next time you picture that early church, don't imagine peace. Imagine tension, argument, scrolls on a table. One with Mary's vision of the soul's ascent, one with Judas's secret destiny, and a hand quietly reaching to set them aside. You don't notice it at first? The Gospel of Mary doesn't shout its heresies. It whispers them gently in the folds of a conversation. No dragons, no flaming swords, no rebel angels. Just Mary seated among confused men, describing a vision of the soul's journey, one that subtly untangles the entire framework of sin sacrifice and sacred authority. But make no mistake, this is Gnostic. Not the rigid, organized kind, but the fluid, emotional, experiential stream of thought that ran alongside early Christianity, like an underground river. And in Mary's voice it surfaces in glimmers, shimmering ideas that suggest salvation isn't earned through ritual or obedience, but by seeing the world as it truly is and letting it go. It starts with the vision itself. Mary recounts a soul rising through four hostile powers: darkness, desire, ignorance, and wrath. These aren't sins in the way Sunday school might define them. They're more like emotional forces, cosmic obstacles, that cling to the soul as it tries to ascend. She doesn't defeat them with fire or angels. She answers them, calmly, with understanding, and they fall away. There's no priest in sight, no altar, no forgiveness requested from an external judge. Just the soul struggling to remember its origin, struggling to return. That's Gnostic thinking in its purest form, salvation through gnosis knowledge. Not memorized theology, but internal realization. The world isn't evil exactly. It's just a distraction, a weighted veil. And liberation comes not by conquering it, but by releasing your hold on it. This is where Mary's gospel gets dangerous, because if the soul ascends without the church, what is the church for if desire and wrath are answered by the soul itself, not by confession and penance? Then what power remains for the institution? None. Or at least not the kind that bishops like to carry in rings and robes. And the implications go further. In the vision, Mary is not just recounting a personal revelation. She's embodying it. She speaks with confidence, clarity, authority. She becomes the teacher. The soul unburdened speaks through her, and the others, the men, the supposed leaders, falter. Peter resists. Levi defends. But no one matches her clarity. No one else has seen what she has. In that moment, Mary isn't just a figure from the margins. She's the blueprint of a different kind of Christian leadership. One rooted not in apostolic succession, but in spiritual insight. not in gender or title, but in transformation. That's not just progressive, that's revolutionary. And this is where scholars often disagree. Some argue that the Gospel of Mary is only lightly Gnostic, that it borrows some ideas but lacks the full cosmological system of other texts, like the Apocryphon of John. Others say the Gospel reflects a proto-Gnostic community people who hadn't yet built out their pantheon of aeons and demiurges, but who were already moving toward the idea that truth was internal, not institutional. Either way, the Gnostic current is there. It pulses beneath every soft-spoken line. When Mary talks about overcoming the material world, she's not condemning it with fire and brimstone. She's describing a release, a loosening of chains you didn't even realize you were wearing. No judgment, just freedom. And it's in this gentle subversion that the Gospel's sharpest edge lies. Because unlike other Gnostic texts which can read like metaphysical instruction manuals filled with labyrinthine cosmology and beings with names like Zostrianos and Eleleth, Mary's Gospel is relational, personal, human. It invites you in without needing a glossary, which makes its rejection all the more telling. There's a callback here to the earlier section on Mary's authority. She wasn't just silenced because she was a woman. She was silenced because her version of truth couldn't be controlled. No sacraments to regulate. No hierarchy to enforce. Just direct experience with the divine available to anyone with the eyes to see. And this stands in stark contrast to Judas's gospel. Where Mary ascends through insight, Judas is told what must be done, a task handed down from a cosmic source, heavy with consequence. Mary's path is liberating, Judas's is burdensome. One is a personal revelation, the other is a divine trap disguised as destiny. It also subtly challenges the entire structure of sin. In Mary's gospel, there's no original transgression, no need for a blood offering, no divine wrath to appease. The soul's sin is simply forgetting who it is, and salvation is remembering. It's an unlearning, a waking up, which may explain why to some early bishops this gospel read more like a threat than a scripture, because a gospel that says you don't need a church to be saved is a gospel that can't be controlled. And that's the thread running through the whole text, the quiet, steady hum of autonomy, of spirit over structure, of inner light over external law. It's not loud, it doesn't burn, but it endures, like the soul ascending, whispering its name to the winds. It doesn't start with guilt, it starts with stars. In the Gospel of Judas, the opening feeling isn't sorrow or shame. It's disorientation, like stepping into a temple built inside a machine. Gone is the dusty Galilee of fishermen and parables. Here the air crackles with cosmology. Layers of heavens, aeons birthing aeons, divine realms folding over each other like origami. You don't walk through this text, you fall. And waiting at the center of this fall, or maybe rising above it, is Judas. Not the villain, not even the misunderstood friend, but the one person in the gospel who sees what's really happening. The one person who knows that the God everyone else worships isn't the true one, and that the body they cling to isn't where salvation lies. In this vision, sin isn't what you think it is. It's not stealing or cheating or even betrayal in the traditional sense. It's ignorance. Sin is mistaking the imitation for the real, worshiping the creator of the physical world, who in Gnostic thought is actually a lower being, a demiurge. Sin is making sacrifices to a God who built prisons out of skin and dirt. In other words, sin is believing too small. This is why Jesus laughs. Not because he's cruel, but because the disciples still don't get it. They perform rituals to honor a God they don't truly understand. They cling to earthly ideas of righteousness without seeing the layers behind the curtain. It's like someone worshiping the gears of a clock, thinking that's where time comes from. And Judas, he doesn't laugh. He listens. His sin isn't in the betrayal, it's in carrying the weight of knowledge no one else can share. He's the only one Jesus trusts with the real plan that his body must die to free the divine spark trapped inside. It's not death as punishment. It's death as escape. The body isn't sacred. It's scaffolding. This is the gospel of Judas's radical claim that salvation requires destruction. Not of others, of the illusion itself. The illusion that the material world is holy, that flesh is redemptive, that suffering has meaning because a God demands it. It reframes sacrifice entirely. In traditional Christian thought, Jesus' death is the ultimate offering one made to atone for sin. In the Gospel of Judas, it's an act of liberation, not a sacrifice to a God, but a break from the God of this world. And Judas is the only one willing or cursed to pull the lever. There's a bleak grandeur to this theology. No forgiveness, no penance, no resurrection celebration, just knowledge. Cold, precise, cosmic, the kind of knowledge that burns away comfort. Jesus doesn't promise Judas peace. He promises him pain, that he will be hated, that he will die, that his star will ascend, but he will grieve more than all of them. And maybe that's the point. In this telling, salvation doesn't feel like a warm embrace. It feels like exile. Like waking up in a world where everyone else is still dreaming and being asked to shatter the dream knowing they'll hate you for it. This philosophy isn't gentle. It's not Mary's vision of the soul floating through graceful barriers. It's Judas's cosmic demolition job. And yet there's an odd overlap. Both Gospels reject the authority of this world. Both suggest that truth is hidden and that the path to salvation lies in peeling away illusion. But where Mary ascends through calm understanding, Judas detonates the bridge on his way out. Scholars still argue over how to read this. Was the author elevating Judas as a tragic hero? Or was the text critiquing him, showing that knowledge without love becomes just another form of violence? Some say the gospel is a parody of Gnostic thought too exaggerated to take seriously. Others see it as a serious mystical document meant only for initiates. And then there are those who think it was never meant for public reading at all. A ritual text. A test. What's certain is that it was never meant to comfort. The Gospel of Judas doesn't offer salvation as a gift. It offers it as a puzzle, a painful, necessary cut. It sees the world not as fallen, but as counterfeit. And to be saved is to know that deeply, terribly, and act accordingly. And that brings us back to Judas, chosen not to lead or to heal or even to preach, but to break, to carry out an act that would seal his condemnation in the eyes of history, but unlock the divine realm in the eyes of God. He becomes the hinge of the secret plan, and he knows it. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't run. He does the unthinkable because he alone sees that it must be done. There's a line late in the text where Jesus tells him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." It's not poetry, it's the core of the gospel. Judas doesn't betray Jesus. He sets him free. And in doing so, he damns himself. Which leaves us with an unsettling question. If Judas is the only one who understood, does that make the rest of Christianity a beautiful misunderstanding, a sanctified echo of a plan too terrible to teach? The Gospel of Judas doesn't answer. It just leaves the door open and waits to see who dares walk through. Close your eyes just for a moment. Imagine the afterlife not as clouds and halos, but as a journey or a trap. Depending on which gospel you read the moment your body fails, is either the beginning of transcendence or the confirmation of how deeply you've misunderstood everything. In the Gospel of Mary, the afterlife is a return, a remembering. The soul doesn't face judgment from a bearded cosmic judge on a throne. Instead, it travels through invisible realms, shedding illusions like old garments. Each realm holds a challenge, not swords and brimstone, but states of being. Darkness, desire, ignorance, wrath. These aren't punishments, they're attachments. Parts of you that must be understood, named, and released. In Mary's telling, the soul can speak. It can respond. It has agency. This is not a static heaven or fiery hell. It's a movement upward, inward, beyond. And what waits at the end isn't reward or punishment, but rest, stillness, union with something infinite and good. It's a theology that feels more like therapy than religion's salvation, not through belief, but through healing. The journey is gentle, patient, hard, but without fear. Contrast that with the Gospel of Judas. You don't ascend through calm clarity in his gospel. You escape if you're lucky. The afterlife here is cosmic architecture. There are star worlds, realms of incorruptible light, false heavens maintained by ignorant archons, and barriers that bind the soul in matter. If you worship the wrong God, and most people do, your spirit is recycled endlessly through this machinery. Like a divine photocopier with a grudge. It's brutal, icy. In Judas's world, your faith can betray you. If you sacrifice the wrong way, if you pray to the wrong being, you're not just misguided, you're reinforcing the trap. The illusion gets thicker. The soul gets heavier. You're not saved because you believed hard enough. You're saved because you knew the truth. And very few do. Even Jesus in this gospel is above the machinery. He comes from beyond it. He doesn't redeem the world. He exposes it. And when he leaves, he doesn't promise paradise. He promises distance from this realm, from its rulers, from the body that has housed him like a costume. And what about Judas? What awaits him, Jesus tells him that his star will lead the way, that he will be hated, that he will die. But there's a strange comfort hidden in the horror that Judas alone will transcend. That by playing the villain in the material world, he will ascend in the real one. It's not a reward. It's an outcome. Like slipping through a crack in the stage floor while everyone else keeps acting. Both Gospels, in their own way, reject the binary of heaven and hell as later doctrine would define them. In Mary's text, there is no fiery abyss, no eternal damnation. The soul isn't sentenced, it's tested, guided, released. Even its enemies speak, plead, challenge, and the soul responds not with fear, but with truth. Each answer lightens the load. In Judas's text, damnation is repetition. Trapped souls serve the demiurge sacrifice meaninglessly and live again and again, never realizing the system is rigged. Hell isn't punishment, it's ignorance. And paradise not streets of gold. Just freedom. The emotional textures couldn't be more different. Mary's afterlife is a lantern-lit path. Judas's is a tunnel with no light unless you already carry it inside. And both share one unnerving implication: the fate of your soul isn't decided at death. It's revealed. Either you've awakened, or you haven't. These ideas weren't isolated. They echoed beliefs from other Gnostic sects, the Valentinians, the Sathians, who also saw the afterlife not as reward or penalty, but as progression. A sorting of spirits by knowledge, not by morality. You could be good in the worldly sense and still remain trapped. Because goodness isn't enough. Clarity is, and that's what made both Gospels so dangerous. The mainstream church was building a model of salvation that was clear, replicable, enforceable. Do this. Believe that. Avoid this. Pay attention to this guy in the robe. The afterlife had to be described simply heaven or hell, reward or punishment, and it had to be mediated by the church. These alternative gospels undermined that entire system. They offered an afterlife that the church couldn't manage, a path that didn't need a gatekeeper. This tension leads to one of the strangest ironies in the whole story. Mary's vision is hopeful, a slow unfurling of the soul toward peace. Judas's is bleak, a cosmic machine that eats the faithful, and yet both are excluded. Both are branded heresy. One is too gentle, the other too horrifying. The institution apparently had little tolerance for either extreme, and yet here they are. Still read, still discussed, still shaping how we ask the oldest question of all: what happens when we die? If you follow Mary, the answer is you rise. If you follow Judas, it's you break the system and vanish before it traps you again. And somewhere between those two gospels, in the echo of those two visions, you find yourself still alive, still wondering, still listening. It always starts the same way. Not everyone was meant to hear this. You see it again and again, hidden like a thread of quiet defiance. A whisper across the Gospels of Mary and Judas that truth wasn't given equally. It was offered in fragments, in quiet moments. To the ones who asked the wrong questions or dared to understand too much. In the Gospel of Mary, it's subtle. Jesus doesn't stand before a crowd and deliver his final teaching. He shares it with Mary in private, offstage. We're told this not shown it a narrative gap that almost dares you to imagine what was said. When the other disciples ask her to recount it, there's hesitation. Not from her, but from them. They don't know if they can trust what they weren't invited to hear. And when she does speak, Peter challenges her. Not just on the content of her vision, but on the fact that she was chosen to receive it at all. The authority of the message is questioned because of the messenger, because it wasn't shared with the group, because it was secret. In the Gospel of Judas, the theme is louder and colder. Jesus mocks the disciples for their blindness, tells them they're offering sacrifices to a false god, and singles out Judas as the only one who will receive the true teaching. It's not a reward, it's a burden. Jesus doesn't offer comfort. He offers knowledge. He offers Judas the truth that the others can't bear, and perhaps were never meant to. This idea that truth is not distributed evenly, that only certain people are capable or worthy of receiving it, is a hallmark of Gnostic thought. It turns the idea of universal revelation on its head. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus speaks in parables, yes, but the assumption is that salvation is offered to all. In these texts, salvation is filtered, veiled, guarded like a secret too fragile to be shouted from a mountaintop. And this creates a tension not just between characters in the Gospels, but between readers and the texts themselves. You begin to wonder, am I supposed to understand this? Is this message for me? Or for someone more initiated, more enlightened, more broken open by experience? The irony, of course, is that these texts themselves became secrets, buried, forgotten, resurfacing centuries later in fragments. Their entire existence is a parable about lost knowledge, the kind that was always meant to be whispered, never preached. And this exclusivity wasn't just spiritual. It was political. In a world where early Christianity was splintering into dozens of factions, some ecstatic, some ascetic, some esoteric, the claim to special knowledge was a power move. It wasn't enough to believe. You had to know. And not just know, but receive the right teaching from the right source, through the right channel. That's why both Judas and Mary are portrayed the way they are, not as inventors of doctrine, but as recipients. They didn't seize knowledge. It was given to them, handed over like a fragile scroll. In Mary's case, it's offered gently. In Judas's, with the sharp edge of inevitability. But in both cases, the others are left behind. This opens up one of the most enduring theological debates in early Christianity. Did Jesus teach a public message and a private one? Some church fathers, particularly those writing against the Gnostics, insisted no. Everything Jesus taught was out in the open. But others hinted even grudgingly that there were deeper layers. Clement of Alexandria wrote that not all teachings were suitable for all ears. The idea that the deepest truths were veiled wasn't foreign, it just became inconvenient. And inconvenient ideas tend to get labeled heresy. In Mary's Gospel, the private teaching is mystical, internal, deeply human. It doesn't contradict the public message, it just goes further. In Judas's, the private teaching is cosmic, cold, explosive. It doesn't soften the public message, it dismantles it entirely. One deepens the story, the other erases it and redraws the lines. But both Gospels share this sacred imbalance. Not everyone is ready. Not everyone is told. The group is flawed. Consensus is an illusion. And the real truths live in margins. There's a callback here to the earlier visions of the afterlife. In Mary's ascent, the soul progresses by releasing illusion. In Judas's fate, salvation is through seeing what others can't. In both, the journey is inward and difficult, and in both, the guide is someone the others distrust. Which brings you to the present. Sitting here reading these texts, asking questions the church hoped no one would ask. You're not just learning history. You're participating in the same unsettling pattern, being offered knowledge that was once buried, that was once considered too much. So who does get to see the truth? Maybe the ones willing to ask quietly, to sit in the tension, to accept that some doors don't open with doctrine but with curiosity. And maybe if you listen closely, you'll hear what they heard, a voice not shouting from the heavens, but whispering in the dark. It's easy to miss at first. The room feels crowded with men, Peter, Andrew, Levi, all with their voices raised, their doubts aired. But if you listen just a little longer, the gravity shifts. There's Mary. Not peripheral, not silent, but central, calm, clear, and entirely out of place, not because she lacks authority, but because she carries it so naturally. In the Gospel of Mary, she isn't introduced with fanfare. She simply speaks, and when she does, the entire rhythm of the text changes. The other disciples are unsettled, not just because of what she says, but because of who she is. And that's the point. Mary doesn't shout or assert. She doesn't demand authority. She has it. And that, in the early church, may have been the most threatening thing of all. Women in early Christian texts are often there in the background, ministering, funding, witnessing. The canonical Gospels mention Mary Magdalene more than many of the apostles. She's the first to see the risen Christ. But she never preaches, never teaches, never threatens the structure. In her own Gospel, she does all three. Her authority isn't institutional, it's spiritual. She receives private revelation. She comforts the others. She explains the soul's journey through metaphysical forces like wrath and desire. She's not a figurehead. She's a mystic. And when Peter challenges her, it's not just theological discomfort, it's gendered. Did he really speak with a woman and not openly to us? That line has echoed through 2 millennia. Not just as a question, but as a blueprint for exclusion. The discomfort with Mary's voice wasn't doctrinal, it was structural. The early church was being shaped into a hierarchy, one that required stability, lineage, male succession. And Mary stood outside all of it, holding truths no one gave her permission to carry. It's worth remembering that this is not an isolated case. Other early Christian texts, many now labeled apocryphal, include women in prominent roles. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, a woman baptizes herself and is commissioned to preach. In certain Gnostic traditions, feminine aspects of the divine, like Sophia, are central. The tension wasn't just about gender, it was about control. Mary's Gospel presents a version of Christianity that decentralizes authority. No bishop required, no temple needed. Just direct experience, internal revelation, and the courage to speak even when doubted. That kind of model doesn't lend itself to empire. It's too fluid, too unpredictable, too feminine. And that's precisely why her leadership had to be erased or rewritten. Over time, the Mary Magdalene of popular memory was reduced from apostle to penitent, from leader to former prostitute. A narrative detour introduced centuries later cast her not as a seer, but a sinner. Not because the evidence demanded it, but because the hierarchy did. The erasure was surgical. No need to burn texts when you can reshape stories. Keep her at the tomb, but take away her voice. Let her weep, but not teach. Let her follow, but never lead. And yet her gospel survived barely. Fragmented, torn, but clear enough to see what she was trying to do. She wasn't offering herself as a rival to Peter. She wasn't demanding authority. She was answering a call, one the others couldn't hear, or didn't want to. This tension plays out again and again in the Gospel's dialogue. Peter resists her vision. Levi defends her. The group hesitates, and then they go out to preach. Not because a council told them to, not because Peter gave them orders, but because Mary reminded them who they were. She restored their courage. She didn't just have authority, she used it. This recalls an earlier thread, the private revelation Mary received. It wasn't an elite secret. It was healing. And yet, because she was a woman, her authority was questioned. Her truth was too embodied, too emotional, too unmanageable for the rising institutional structure. In contrast, Judas receives secret knowledge too. But his is cold, cosmic, terrifying. And even then he's cast out not because he's a woman, but because his knowledge burns the structure down rather than reforming it. Judas and Mary are twin challenges to hierarchy, one through mysticism, the other through destruction. And both are cast aside. But Mary's threat is gentler and maybe more enduring. Judas is feared, Mary is doubted. Doubt corrodes more slowly, but just as thoroughly. It seeps into memory. It reshapes reputation. It erases without fire. Still, there's something about her presence that refuses to vanish. The Gospel of Mary didn't disappear. It lingered in fragments, rediscovered centuries later, just enough to hear her voice again. And maybe that's all it takes, one voice calm and clear in a room full of fear and doubt. Because the question isn't whether Mary was at the center. It's whether the center was ever supposed to be where we were looking. There's something uniquely unsettling about seeing the villain get promoted. Not reformed, not forgiven, promoted. Judas, in nearly every tradition, is the betrayer. His name alone has become shorthand for treachery, a hiss between syllables. Even among the more generous readings of the Gospel story, Judas is rarely given a second chance. But in the Gospel of Judas, he isn't just redeemed, he's recast. Not as the mistake in the story, but as its fulfillment. And that was too much. Not just for the bishops polishing their creeds in Rome, but even for groups already flirting with the fringes. even for the ones used to gospels with secret gods and metaphysical staircases. Judas chosen that hit a nerve. You have to understand, even in the wide and wild landscape of early Christian thought, some rules were unspoken but firm. Salvation might look different, the divine might wear different masks, but certain characters had their places. Peter was the rock, Mary the witness, Judas. The proof that free will came with consequences. You could play with the mechanics of the crucifixion, but not who made it happen. The Gospel of Judas explodes that rule. It takes the most reviled man in Christian memory and makes him the only one who understood the plan. It frames his act, the handoff, the kiss, not as betrayal, but as transcendence, a brutal, divinely sanctioned necessity. And the others, the so-called apostles, they're described as sacrificing to false gods, practicing rituals that please the wrong divine beings. Blind, loud, lost. Even among Gnostic groups, communities well-versed in dual gods, hidden truths, and suspicious cosmologies, this was a theological Molotov cocktail. Most Gnostic texts had already demoted the creator god of Genesis, reframing him as a lesser being, the demiurge Yaldabaoth, who crafted the material world out of ignorance or pride. But few dared to rewrite the roles of Jesus' closest companions so violently, to mock the apostles, to single out Judas as the only one with vision. That wasn't just revision, it was inversion. And inversion, even in spiritual counterculture, has its limits. There's a peculiar echo here to Mary's gospel. She too receives private revelation. She too is doubted by the group. But where Mary's knowledge is soft and healing, Judas's is volcanic. She is a balm, he is a scalpel. And both are cast aside, but Judas's exclusion feels like a preemptive strike, a defense mechanism against an idea too corrosive to entertain. Because if Judas is right, then everything crumbles. The Eucharist becomes meaningless. The Passion becomes performance. Sin becomes a misunderstanding and salvation a cosmic play with a script written in stars. The Church's rituals aren't just insufficient, they're actively blinding. And worst of all, the chosen betrayer walks away with the only key that fits the divine lock. Even among Gnostic circles, which often blurred the lines between betrayer and revealer, there was hesitation to go that far. Some scholars suggest the Gospel of Judas may have been written against certain Gnostic factions, not as a praise of Judas, but as a critique of their elitism. Others think it was a genuinely radical retelling meant to provoke, to shake loose assumptions about good and evil action and intention. But the reaction speaks for itself. The gospel vanishes. It doesn't get copied. It isn't referenced with reverence. It's buried, fragmented, smuggled across centuries in silence. Not because it was uninteresting, but because it was unmanageable. There's something almost theatrical in how the gospel stages its scandal. Jesus laughs often and not kindly. He isolates Judas. He tells him secrets. He dismisses the other apostles as bumbling and misguided. It feels less like a gospel and more like a critique of a system, a sharp editorial tucked inside cosmic language. And yet the emotional center isn't triumph, it's tragedy. Judas is not glorified. He is not given a reward. He's told that generations will curse his name, that his death will come soon, that his spirit will suffer. And still, he must do this. It's the kind of divine burden that leaves no room for redemption, because the act was the redemption. It calls back to earlier questions of predestination and choice. If Judas was chosen to betray not because of weakness, but because of strength, what kind of God makes that choice? What kind of gospel celebrates that act? Even within speculative theology, there are lines. Judas didn't just cross them, he erased them. which makes his elevation not just controversial, but scandalous, the kind of scandal that quiets a room, that makes even the heretics look nervous. Because if the worst act is actually the holiest, then how do we trust anything? It's unsettling for modern readers too. We're trained to seek moral clarity in our stories, to forgive maybe, but to elevate betrayal to divine status, that tastes strange. Even now, even after centuries of layered interpretation. And perhaps that's the final echo of Judas's gospel. It doesn't ask you to like him. It doesn't rehabilitate his image. It dares you to consider the possibility that salvation was never about morality at all, but about knowledge, timing, and the willingness to be misunderstood forever. Because what's more scandalous than a traitor who did exactly what was asked and still burned for it? It didn't happen overnight. The church didn't suddenly wake up one day with a list of banned books, a papal ring, and a basilica in every province. Rome's grip tightened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a vine wrapping around stone. But by the time the alternative gospels realized what was happening, the gate had closed, and it was locked from the inside. The early Jesus movement was many things: ecstatic, fragmented, improvisational. There were communities who baptized in rivers under moonlight, others who fasted and wept, waiting for the world to end. Some followed Peter, others Paul. Some read from scrolls that preached love and simplicity. Others read ones that mapped the stars, warned of false gods, or told of secrets whispered to a woman. It was messy, beautiful in a way, and unsustainable. Enter Rome. Not the empire itself, not yet, but the Church of Rome. A community that over time grew in confidence and centrality. While Christians in Egypt were sorting through visions and dialogues, the Roman Church was doing something else, entirely organizing. Writing letters, appointing leaders, creating consistency, and with consistency came credibility. With credibility came influence. There's a reason why Peter's bones were said to lie in Rome. Not because he died there, though tradition says he did, but because placing him there gave weight to the Church's claim. Apostolic succession. Authority passed down not by spirit, but by office. A holy lineage mapped like an empire. And once you have authority, you get to decide what counts. It's no coincidence that the Gospels of Mary and Judas found no sanctuary there. Mary's gospel, with its vision of inner ascent and feminine leadership, didn't lend itself to structure. Judas's gospel, with its scathing critique of ritual sacrifice and institutional blindness, was even worse. These weren't just alternative stories. They were threats to the architecture being built, an architecture that needed pillars, rules, and a gospel that could be read aloud without causing a doctrinal aneurysm. And Rome had learned something from the empire it shadowed. If you want to last, you don't just fight battles, you write history. The process was incremental. Certain letters were favored, certain gospels were copied more often. Others faded from circulation, not through violence, but through silence. Scribes chose what to preserve. Bishops chose what to teach. Communities that didn't align with the emerging consensus were labeled sects, their leaders heretics. Not always excommunicated, sometimes just excluded. But there were darker tools too. Gospels were denounced. Scrolls were burned. Teachers were anathematized. And all of this under the banner of unity, a noble goal perhaps, but unity at the cost of diversity is just another kind of empire. The Gospel of Mary, with its gentle rejection of hierarchy and its portrayal of a woman leading the apostles, was quietly too much. The Gospel of Judas, with its metaphysical assault on the foundation of sacrificial theology, was loudly too much. Neither could be absorbed without tearing seams in the increasingly tight fabric of orthodoxy, and that fabric was getting tighter by the decade. By the late 2nd century, Irenaeus, a bishop from Lyon with a strong distaste for anything too interesting, was already writing against the Gnostics. In his massive work against heresies, he insisted there were only 4 true Gospels. Why 4? Because there are 4 winds, 4 corners of the earth. He wasn't subtle, he was strategic, and his canon became the blueprint. From that point on, the Church moved not just to teach, but to define, to curate the boundaries of belief. And once something is declared outside those boundaries, its survival depends on luck, not loyalty. Still, the voices persisted. In scraps, in whispers, in buried codices sealed in desert jars. There's a moment here that recalls Mary's final appearance in her gospel when she finishes speaking and waits. The others don't cheer. They don't rush to follow her. They pause. Doubt. Some believe. Others waver. That's the moment the early church was in, standing between stories, choosing which ones to carry forward. And in that choice, they silenced her. Judas's silence is colder. His gospel doesn't even pretend to offer reconciliation. It reads like the final word of a doomed figure, prophetic, furious, uncompromising. It doesn't care whether it's accepted. It already knows it won't be. And maybe that's why both gospels were buried, not broadcast. They didn't ask for power. They asked for reflection, for risk, for the kind of knowledge that unseats certainty. And Rome increasingly needed certainty. So the church grew, doctrines hardened, councils formed, and slowly the idea that Jesus might have spoken differently to different people, that salvation might come through knowing or through betrayal or through a woman's voice, became unthinkable. And yet the texts remain, despite everything, fragile, fragmented, and still speaking. Which raises the quiet question, if Rome hadn't won, what would Christianity look like now? You can almost picture the room. Candles flickering, robes rustling, scrolls unrolled and argued over. Men with furrowed brows debating the fate of ideas older than their language. This wasn't just theology, it was politics, identity, control. They called them councils. They might as well have called them coronations for the winners, at least. The formation of the Christian canon wasn't a single moment, but a long choreography of meetings, letters, exclusions, and edicts. And each step in that dance sealed the fate of gospels that didn't align. The Gospel of Mary. The Gospel of Judas. Texts once copied by hand with devotion were now being declared dangerous. Not because they were provably false, but because they were deeply inconvenient. The earliest Christians didn't have a New Testament. They had letters and stories, testimonies passed around on parchment read aloud in house churches. For generations, the idea of canon was fluid. One community might cherish the Gospel of Thomas, another the Shepherd of Hermas. It wasn't chaos. It was variation, organic, unpolished, human. But as the church grew in size and influence, especially after the Emperor Constantine's conversion, variation started to look like a problem. Christianity had gone from outlaw faith to imperial partner, and the empire doesn't do ambiguity. It needed a faith that could be explained on parchment and enforced with a sword. So the councils began. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is the most famous, but not for deciding the canon. That came later. What Nicaea did do was establish precedent that the church had the authority to decide what counted, who Jesus was, what salvation meant, and eventually what could be read from the pulpit without raising theological eyebrows. The process of finalizing the canon took centuries. By the time of Athanasius's Easter letter in 367 CE, we see the first recorded list that matches today's New Testament. 27 books. No Mary. No Judas. No trace of the soul's gentle ascent or the divine logic of betrayal. That wasn't coincidence. It was intentional. Councils didn't just affirm books. They erased others, and not always with fire, though sometimes, yes, with fire. More often, they silenced by omission. Scribes stopped copying. Priests stopped teaching. The texts faded not because people stopped believing in them, but because they stopped being allowed to speak. Censorship didn't need to be loud. It needed only time. There's a dark elegance to how this worked. A council wouldn't say this gospel is heresy. It would say this one is inspired. And by affirming a few, it condemned the rest to slow oblivion. Mary's visions of a soul rising through hostile forces gone. Judas's depiction of Jesus laughing at the disciples unthinkable. These weren't just theological oddities. They were dangerous disruptions to the emerging orthodoxy. The orthodoxy that needed clear categories: heaven, hell, sin, redemption. It didn't have room for nuance or spiritual metaphors that required interpretation. The mystical had to be reined in, the visionary replaced with the catechism, and any gospel that couldn't be explained to a congregation in 10 minutes became a liability. There's a callback here to earlier sections to Mary's authority, Judas's burden, and the private teachings both were given. What unites their gospels isn't just what they say, it's how they refuse to conform. Mary teaches without permission. Judas betrays without shame. Neither of them fits into the neat boxes the church was building. So the boxes were sealed and they were shut out. Some scholars argue this was necessary, that the church needed stability, that unity was more important than diversity, that heresy wasn't about suppression but survival, and maybe they're right. But the cost was high. Centuries of spiritual imagination buried beneath doctrinal consistency. What's more haunting is that even as the councils defined what could be read, they never fully managed to silence what had been written. Fragments survived, hidden in jars, folded into codices, copied in secret. And when they resurfaced in a Berlin museum, a Coptic cave, a safety deposit box in Long Island, they reminded us of everything that was left behind. It wasn't just theology, it was possibility. Because every gospel excluded from the canon is a version of Christianity that could have been. One where Mary taught the disciples, where Judas was understood, where salvation was something you uncovered in the soul, not purchased through ritual or dictated by creed. The councils gave the church its spine. But in doing so, they also trimmed away its stranger, softer limbs. The ones that reached toward stars and shadows and truths too complicated to canonize. So the next time you hear the word heresy, remember it doesn't mean false. It means forbidden. And sometimes what gets forbidden says more about who's afraid than who's wrong. It wasn't enough to ignore them. It wasn't even enough to exclude them. The Gospels of Mary and Judas and others like them had to be buried, had to be branded. Not simply forgotten, but made dangerous. The early church didn't have printing presses, but it had scribes and fire. And it learned early that the best way to preserve a narrative was to destroy the alternatives. These alternative gospels weren't just deviations. They were threats to structure, to theology, to the delicate lattice of control being built, word by word, bishop by bishop. And so heresy became a hammer. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, church leaders weren't just preaching the truth. They were naming the enemy. Gnostics, Valentinians, Scythians, Montanists. Theologies that once coexisted with the proto-Orthodox current were now being cast as cancer's infections to be burned out. It wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was rhetorical, but the outcome was the same spiritual censorship disguised as protection. The Gospel of Mary, with its elevation of feminine authority and rejection of ritual law, was more than a theological outlier. It was subversive. If salvation came through insight, then what role was left for priests? If a woman could receive divine revelation, what need was there for apostolic succession? It didn't just whisper a different salvation, it whispered a different church. The Gospel of Judas, meanwhile, was a fire starter from the start. A Jesus who laughed at his disciples, a sacrificial system condemned as worship to a false god. A betrayer celebrated as the only one who truly saw the plan. Even to sympathetic readers, this was a grenade tossed into the altar. You couldn't canonize this gospel without canonizing chaos, so they were denounced. Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, mentioned a group who believed Judas alone knew the truth and fulfilled a divine mission. He didn't name a gospel, but it's hard not to draw the line. Others followed. Tertullian, Epiphanius. They catalogued heresies like naturalists documenting venomous plants, dangerous to touch, deadly to believe. And once something is declared heresy, its fate is sealed. Churches purged their libraries. Scribes stopped copying the texts. In some cases, scrolls were destroyed, burned, or torn, repurposed as binding material, scraped and overwritten. It wasn't malicious in every case. Sometimes it was practical. Space was limited. Parchment was precious. Why preserve what you're told is poison, but in Egypt something strange happened. Some communities didn't burn the heresies. They buried them, not in protest, but in fear, in reverence, maybe even in hope. Dozens of texts were hidden in jars sealed in caves near Nag Hammadi, not far from where the Gospel of Judas would later be found, in its own forgotten tomb of papyrus and decay. These weren't accidents. These were acts of quiet rebellion. The people who buried these Gospels knew the tide had turned. The councils had spoken. The bishops had drawn their lines. But they believed or feared that these texts still mattered. And so they gave them to the earth in the same way you might hide a candle during a storm, not to extinguish it, but to keep it safe. And for over 1,000 years it worked. Until 1945, when two Egyptian brothers stumbled on a sealed jar of codices. Until 1970, when a codex containing the Gospel of Judas was unearthed, mishandled, sold, lost, and found again. What resurfaced wasn't just old theology. It was an alternate map of salvation, one that had been deliberately torn from the atlas. And what makes this so haunting is that in some ways the campaigns worked. The Gospel of Mary exists only in fragments. 3 manuscripts, none complete. Gaps like missing teeth where her vision once soared. The Gospel of Judas fared worse, battered by water damage, eaten by mold, nearly destroyed by neglect and greed. It's a miracle we have them at all. And yet, despite the damage, the message survives. Not intact, not certain, but unmistakable. These weren't gospels of chaos. They were gospels of contrast. And contrast is dangerous in any system that claims singular truth. There's a callback here to earlier sections, to the councils that curated belief, to the church that chose which voices to carry forward, to Mary's rejection, to Judas's condemnation. And behind all of it, this quiet, relentless pattern disagreement becomes dissent. Dissent becomes heresy. Heresy becomes silence. And silence, too, is a kind of violence. What we inherit, then, is not just a collection of texts. It's a collection of survivors. Words that lived only because someone broke the rules, because someone copied them in secret, because someone somewhere decided that forbidden knowledge was still worth keeping. So yes, these Gospels were buried. Yes, they were branded heresy. But they weren't destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, the truth has always known how to wait. It doesn't begin with fanfare. It begins with dirt, with dust and sweat and the unmistakable sound of something ancient cracking open beneath the weight of centuries. Not a cathedral, not a seminary, just a dry hillside in Egypt and a jar that no one expected to matter. And yet inside that jar was the echo of a gospel the world thought it had silenced. That's how the gospel of Mary returned. And a few decades later, it happened again, this time in the Egyptian desert near El Minya. A tattered codex unearthed not by archaeologists in clean white gloves, but by looters digging for treasure. The kind of scene that feels more like a movie than scripture. But instead of gold, they found papyrus. And inside it, the Gospel of Judas, worn fragile, stitched into the back of history, like a warning we weren't supposed to find. The rediscovery of these Gospels was not dignified. It was chaotic, human, and almost didn't happen. The Gospel of Mary came first, tucked inside a 5th-century Coptic codex, acquired in 1896 by a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt at a Cairo antiquities market. The codex also contained other texts, the Apocryphon of John, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, and more. But the Gospel of Mary stood out immediately. A woman speaking with authority, a vision of the soul's journey, and most shockingly, a Jesus who entrusts her with secret teaching. It wasn't a complete text. The beginning and end were missing, torn away before anyone living could read them. Still, what survived was enough to unsettle scholars and excite mystics alike. It sat in the Berlin Museum archives, largely unread until the 1950s. And even then, it would take decades before it reached public consciousness. Mary's voice, once whispered in the margins, returned slowly, half-sentence by half-sentence. Then came Judas. His gospel surfaced in the 1970s, but its resurrection was a mess. Found by a group of looters in a limestone cave, the codex, later dubbed Codex Chacos, passed through smugglers, black market dealers, and negligent collectors. It spent years in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York, where humidity and ignorance nearly destroyed it. The pages turned to flakes, ink faded, mold took root. By the time it reached scholars in the early 2000s, it was almost unreadable. The National Geographic Society stepped in, funding a massive restoration effort. Scientists worked with infrared imaging, piecing together scraps no larger than a fingernail. Translators squinted at broken Coptic, trying to rebuild a story that had been torn and scattered across continents. And when it was finally published in 2006, the world was stunned. This wasn't the Judas we were taught to despise. This was a man Jesus trusted. A man who through betrayal fulfilled the divine will, and perhaps even more scandalously, a man singled out from the others not for failure, but for understanding. The academic community exploded, some calling it a revelation, others a misreading. Was this really a defense of Judas, or a critique of Christian ritual wrapped in Gnostic code? The debate, like the gospel itself, refused to stay buried. These discoveries didn't just challenge theology, they challenged how history is made. Because the real question wasn't why these texts existed, it was why they disappeared. And once found, why they were still so hard to hear. There's a callback here to the councils and censorship we've already followed, how heretical texts weren't just banned, but systematically erased from collective memory. What the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas represent in their crumbling resurrection is not just theological dissent. They are artifacts of deliberate forgetting, the kind of forgetting that requires effort. And yet they survived, because someone copied them by hand. someone hid them. Someone chose not to destroy them. The rediscovery of these Gospels is as much about those anonymous guardians as it is about the texts themselves. People who didn't sign their names, but who believed these words mattered enough to risk everything. Even now, fragments continue to appear in antique shops, private collections, mislabeled museum boxes. Some are fakes, others are priceless. But each carries the same question in its fibers. What else is still buried? How much of what we think we know about Christianity rests on the silence of other scrolls? And that's the haunting beauty of the archaeological trail. It reminds us that history isn't static. It's layered, alive, waiting. Mary's voice rises not from the pulpit, but from sand and time. Judas's hand doesn't clutch silver but ink telling a story no one wanted to hear. And when you hold these Gospels in your mind, even for a moment, the earth beneath doctrine begins to feel a little less solid, a little more like parchment, a little more like something that could still be rewritten. You'd think the hardest part was finding them, that once the dirt was brushed away and the papyrus lifted from its grave, the stories would speak clearly. But they didn't. They rarely do. Because the real battle begins after the discovery, not with shovels and jars, but with verbs, commas, and motive. Translation is a strange form of resurrection. It breathes life into words thought dead, but it never brings back the same body. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas didn't just re-emerge into scholarly discussion, they walked straight into a theological minefield. What do you do with a gospel that tells you everything you thought you knew about betrayal, sacrifice, and salvation? Was upside down. The Gospel of Mary, while discovered earlier, took decades to enter public consciousness. The biggest challenge wasn't just its content, but its condition. The manuscript was incomplete, missing its first 6 pages and a large chunk of its middle. Translators were forced to reconstruct meaning from what remained, filling gaps with careful inferences and hopeful guesses. Words were debated line by line. Was Mary describing an actual journey through metaphysical realms? Or was it allegory, where the powers she confronted meant to be cosmic gatekeepers or inner psychological forces? The text didn't explain itself, and scholars didn't agree. Some argued that Mary's gospel aligned with mainstream Christian mysticism, just with gentler metaphors and an unexpected messenger. Others insisted it was a radical Gnostic text, cloaked in language so quiet it was mistaken for orthodoxy. And beneath all of that, a deeper tension: were we interpreting the text fairly, or through a lens shaped by centuries of patriarchal theology? Then came Judas, and with him the storm. From the moment the Gospel of Judas was announced in 2006, it was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary translation job. The text was in tatters, sections missing, lines warped by moisture and mold. It had passed through too many hands, too many humid bank vaults to be trusted without skepticism. National Geographic stepped in with funding and visibility, publishing a translation alongside a glossy documentary. Headlines screamed, "Judas redeemed," the narrative was set. This gospel was a vindication, a total reimagining of Judas Iscariot as the hero of the story. But not everyone agreed. Almost immediately, scholars began to question the translation. Did the Coptic word in question really mean Judas was set apart for a holy task? Or was it a form of condemnation? Had Jesus called him chosen or cursed? The differences were subtle: inflection, context. A line read one way could depict Judas as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. Read another, it could portray him as the ultimate fool manipulated into sealing his own fate. The debates weren't just academic, they were existential. because buried inside every interpretive choice was a theological landmine. If Judas was chosen, then the entire concept of betrayal collapses. If he wasn't, then the gospel becomes a satire, a bleak joke about a man too blind to see the trap he walked into. To complicate matters further, parts of the codex were still missing, and some had been sold, separated, or lost during its black market journey. Pages may have been discarded or destroyed. Every reading of the text was provisional, haunted by the knowledge that the full picture might never emerge. The publication process itself came under scrutiny. National Geographic was accused of rushing the translation to meet a media deadline. Critics claimed that scholarly consensus hadn't yet formed that the gospel was being packaged for public consumption before the ink was even dry on the debates. And in the middle of it all, Judas silent as ever, his gospel still fragmentary, still flickering with contradictions, became a canvas for projection. Was he a hero, a scapegoat, a warning, a mystic, a pawn? What both Gospels remind us is that translation isn't neutral, it's interpretation. Every word rendered from Coptic to English passes through the translator's mind, shaped by their training, their assumptions, their theology. It's not a mirror, it's a prism. The light changes on the way through. Mary's calm revelations, Judas's unsettling laughter. Neither comes to us in a pure voice. We hear them filtered, fractured. And that's not a flaw. It's the nature of all recovered things. There's a callback here to their burial, the jars, the decay, the long silence. Just as their survival depended on human hands, so too does their meaning. What we hear in their Gospels says as much about us as it does about them. And that may be the hardest truth of all, that even now we're not reading these texts. We're still negotiating them. Every new translation is an argument in disguise, every footnote a battle, every silence a choice. And somehow, despite the gaps, the damage, and the centuries of erasure, Mary and Judas are still speaking. The question is, how will we choose to hear them? You thought there was just one Jesus, one mission, one purpose, one clean narrative, born, died, rose, ascended. But what if there were two, not two people, but two interpretations? Two blueprints laid over the same name. Two gospels telling stories that can't be folded into each other without tearing at the seams. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas don't just offer alternate views of discipleship. They present radically different visions of Jesus himself, not just in tone or personality, but in cosmic role. Who he is, why he came, what he left behind. Mary's Jesus is a healer, not of bodies, but of perception. He speaks of inner struggles of rising above ignorance, of letting go. When he teaches her privately, intimately, it's not about ritual, it's about release. The soul ascends through layers of emotion and illusion, not through external sacrifice or belief. He's gentle, serene, almost maternal in his approach. He offers reassurance, not fear, guidance, not command. This is a Jesus who awakens, not one who suffers. Judas's Jesus is something else entirely. He's sharp, ironic, unsettling. He laughs often, not out of joy, but at the disciples' misunderstanding. He doesn't perform miracles or soothe wounds. He critiques. He deconstructs. He reveals a world that is not holy, but constructed, a simulation held together by false worship and blind ritual. In this gospel, Jesus doesn't save the world. He exposes it. And he does so by arranging his own destruction, choosing Judas as the trigger. This is a Jesus who escapes, not one who redeems. And in that contrast lies the fracture, two messiahs. One who teaches liberation through knowing the self. one who offers salvation by shedding the body and ascending beyond the material, one who comforts, one who disrupts. Both speak to suffering, but only one sanctifies it. Mary's Jesus never speaks of a cross. He doesn't talk about sacrifice. Instead, he imparts wisdom meant to free the soul from its attachments, desire, ignorance, wrath. His message is internalized. It asks the listener to transform from within, to face the emotional architecture that binds them to a world of illusion. It's not a dramatic moment of salvation. It's a slow unveiling of truth. In Judas's gospel, Jesus knows what must be done. The betrayal is essential. The crucifixion is the mechanism by which his divine essence is freed from its human form. There is no call to repent, no promise of forgiveness. Just knowledge, terrible and clear. He selects Judas not out of affection, but because Judas alone has the strength, or perhaps the blindness, to play the role required. This vision recalls an earlier thread salvation, not as comfort, but as rupture. The Gospel of Judas leans hard into Gnostic cosmology, where the material world is a prison and the soul a spark longing to return to its source. Jesus, then, is not a redeemer of sin, but a liberator of essence, a guide for those who can see, and a stumbling block for those who cannot. Both Gospels remove Jesus from the theological center of mainstream Christianity, but they do so in opposite directions. Mary's Jesus becomes a mentor for self-realization. Judas's Jesus becomes an alien intelligence orchestrating escape, and between them lies a question that no counsel could easily answer: what is salvation? For is it to repair what was broken in the garden, or to awaken from the dream of the garden entirely? Is Jesus here to fulfill the law, or to dismantle it from the inside? The canonical Gospels lean toward fulfillment. Jesus as sacrificial lamb, as atonement, as divine presence walking among us. But the alternative Gospels, especially Mary and Judas, peel back the floorboards. Mary whispers, "The kingdom is already within you." Judas mutters, "The world is a counterfeit." Jesus in both is not here to explain the rules. He's here to break them. These visions aren't reconcilable. You can't have a Messiah whose death is cosmic necessity, and one whose teachings bypass death altogether. You can't center both ritual sacrifice and inner awakening without tearing the foundation, which is exactly what early church leaders feared. Because if Jesus is a mystic teacher, then the institution becomes irrelevant. If Jesus is an interdimensional agent dismantling creation, then the institution becomes complicit in the illusion. In both cases, the church loses its role. There's a callback here to how these texts were received. Mary questioned. Judas condemned. Both offer a Messiah who doesn't need a pulpit, who doesn't demand obedience, who doesn't build a temple. Instead, they offer a presence elusive, powerful, deeply personal, that points not to law, but to transformation. And perhaps that's what made these Gospels so dangerous. Not that they contradicted the canon, but that they offered Jesus without permission. It doesn't begin with sin, it begins with memory. In the Gospel of Mary, the soul is not guilty, it's forgetful, not stained, but sleeping. And salvation doesn't come from a priest or a cross or a creed, it comes from waking up. Mary's Gospel offers a vision of liberation that is almost scandalously gentle. There is no altar, no sacrificial system, no blood-soaked offering to appease a wrathful God. Instead, there is understanding, quiet, subtle. The soul climbs not through punishment, but through perception. And Jesus, rather than being the sacrifice, is the guide, the one who reminds you who you already are. This path is slow. It resists spectacle. There are no dramatic conversions, no thunder from heaven. Mary's gospel whispers through dialogue, through imagery. The soul speaks. The obstacles it meets, the powers of darkness. Desire, ignorance, wrath are not defeated with swords or angels. They are addressed, answered, dismantled by clarity. Each power challenges the soul as it ascends, and each time the soul responds not with violence, but with insight. I did not recognize you as my master, the soul says to one. You did not see me, but I saw you. These aren't battle cries, they're statements of awareness, and with each reply, a chain breaks. This isn't a salvation of permission, it's a salvation of realization. You don't receive it, you remember it. You were always light. You were always divine. You just forgot. And Mary in this gospel becomes the first to remember. Her leadership is inseparable from this understanding. She's not chosen for her loyalty or her bloodline. She's chosen because she sees. When the disciples fall into confusion and despair, it's Mary who restores them, not by performing miracles or quoting scripture, but by reminding them of what Jesus taught. That they carry the divine within, that fear is a veil, that the path is inward. It's a radical kind of leadership, not assertive but deeply grounded. She doesn't need to shout. Her authority flows from her calm, and that calm is rooted in understanding. This model of salvation challenges every assumption that emerged in the centuries after. It offers no substitutionary atonement, no external mediator, no institution between soul and source. It decentralizes power with a kind of quiet precision that made it frankly ungovernable. If everyone can awaken, then no one needs permission to begin. And that's where the conflict begins. Because if salvation comes through understanding, then theology becomes less about regulation and more about reflection. The role of the church shifts from gatekeeper to reminder, from arbiter to companion. It loses its teeth, its control, its ability to draw a hard line between saved and lost. There's an earlier callback here to Mary's confrontation with Peter. His challenge isn't about her ideas, it's about her legitimacy. Did he really speak with a woman and not to us, Peter demands to know. It's a demand born not of doubt, but of fear. Because if Mary's understanding is valid, then so is hers alone, and the entire system of inherited authority begins to tremble. This gospel isn't just mystical, it's political. It suggests that salvation doesn't require alignment with doctrine, but alignment with truth. That the soul doesn't need to be fixed, only remembered. That healing is not imposed from above, but discovered within. And Mary's Jesus never once demands worship. He teaches, he listens, he reveals, and then he disappears, not in abandonment, but in trust. Because what he's given her is enough. For some scholars, this vision aligns with a broader trend in early Christian mysticism, a current that valued apatheia, inner stillness, knowledge of self, and a transformative encounter with the divine, not mediated by blood law or sacrifice. It wasn't Gnosticism in the rigid sense, but something adjacent, perhaps older or simply freer. Others argue that this gospel is a late invention, projecting a modern sense of individual spirituality backward onto the ancient world. But even if the text is late, the hunger it reveals is ancient. The hunger for a salvation that doesn't punish, that doesn't require you to be less than yourself. Instead, it asks you to become yourself fully soul without shadow, light without fear. This is why the Gospel of Mary still resonates even now. It doesn't provide a checklist. It doesn't shout. It opens a door and waits. You walk through when you're ready. And maybe that's what salvation is in her world. Not something you're given, but something you recognize. A moment where the noise fades, where the fear lifts, and the voice you hear next is your own finally remembering how to speak. It starts with laughter. Again. Jesus laughs not out of joy, but out of knowing. The disciples don't understand him. Their prayers are misdirected, their offerings hollow. They're caught in a dream they think is real. But Judas sees through it. That's why the laughter turns for once into recognition. In the Gospel of Judas, salvation isn't found in the heart or the mind. It's not discovered through the shedding of illusions or the ascent of the soul. It comes through something far more brutal: sacrifice. Not of yourself, not as a metaphor, but of Jesus. Not because he was defeated, because he had to be. Judas is chosen not because he loves Jesus most, but because he's the only one who can carry the unbearable truth. That in order for Jesus to be set free, someone has to hand him over. And it has to be someone who understands what they're doing. Someone who knows that the body must fall so the divine can rise. This is not about guilt. It's about necessity. Judas's act is not a betrayal of friendship. It's a transaction at the edge of cosmic design. Jesus says to him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Not kill me, not destroy me. Sacrifice the man, the container, the flesh, the prison." The implication is staggering, that Jesus' true self is not the man, but the divine essence within, and Judas alone can sever the cord. This is salvation through rupture, through pain, through obedience to a plan only two people understand. But it's not reward. Jesus tells Judas plainly that he will be cursed, that he will be hated, that his fate will be worse than the others. Judas is given the truth, but not the glory. He becomes the villain in every gospel that comes after, because no one else was meant to know the cost. It's a bleak theology, cold, impersonal. There is no ascent through love or wisdom. There is no transformation of the heart. There is only the machinery of heaven grinding its gears, and a single man told to throw himself into them. This contrasts sharply with Mary's vision, where salvation is a return to harmony, a shedding of burdens. In Judas's vision, salvation must be carved out violently, a divine jailbreak pulled off by someone willing to burn their name forever in order to spring the lock. And this makes Judas less a disciple and more a tool, a key, one that knows its purpose and consents to be used. The emotional cost of this role is enormous. Jesus tells him that the others will never understand, that his star will shine, but his soul will suffer. There's an echo here to other ancient traditions, scapegoats sent into the wilderness, sacrifices made on behalf of the people. But never before has the scapegoat been aware, willing, necessary. For some readers, this gospel is deeply troubling. It rewrites the crucifixion not as a tragedy or a victory, but as a move on a cosmic chessboard, deliberate and emotionally detached. Jesus becomes less a suffering servant and more a divine strategist. Judas, his only student with clearance for the real plan. Others find a strange grace in it. Because here Judas isn't a monster. He's not greedy. He's not faithless. He's obedient to something larger than himself. He betrays Jesus because he understands him, because he has to, because someone had to. And this raises the question that makes most theologians shift in their seats: if salvation depended on the betrayal, was it betrayal at all? The Gospel of Judas never answers directly. It doesn't reassure. It offers no soft landings. Judas dies, alone, misunderstood. But he does what he's told, not by fear, not by impulse, but by cosmic instruction. And that's what makes this vision of salvation so alien, so unlike the redemptive arcs offered in other Gospels. There's no path here for the rest of us to follow, no teachings to emulate, no virtues to cultivate. There is only this, a role, a moment, a necessary act. One man chosen to bear the burden so the divine can be released. Judas doesn't climb a ladder to heaven. He drops a match into the system. And in the smoke, Jesus ascends. This idea, salvation through destruction, understanding through sacrifice, isn't an easy one. It doesn't inspire many hymns. It doesn't fit on a bookmark. But it lingers. Because deep down it whispers something terrifying, that salvation might not always feel like saving. That the greatest act of faith might look like betrayal to everyone else. And once you hear that, you can't unhear it. You might think the Gospels of Mary and Judas disappeared without a trace, exiled texts swallowed by silence. But the truth is messier, more haunting. Because even after their pages were buried, the ideas they carried echoed on faintly but stubbornly in the rituals, letters, and tensions of the earliest Christian communities. Like a melody hummed under the official hymn. No one ever put up a banner reading Mary's followers this way or welcome to the Church of Judas. And yet, if you listen closely to the fragments of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you can hear them communities that seem to echo these forbidden gospels, even if they never named them. Start with Mary. In various early Christian texts, especially those later branded Gnostic, you find traces of her vision, not just the woman herself, but the worldview she represents. Writings like the Gospel of Thomas, the Dialogue of the Savior and Pistis, Sophia speak of inner knowledge, secret teachings, and the ascent of the soul. They downplay sin and focus instead on ignorance. They reject hierarchy and emphasize personal transformation. Sound familiar? Many of these texts emerged from Egyptian communities, places like Alexandria and Nag Hammadi, where Christian thought brewed alongside Greek philosophy and older mystery religions. These weren't rogue heretics plotting against the bishops. They were sincere seekers exploring a Christianity less defined by blood and more by revelation. And in those communities, women had roles. Not just as caretakers or funders, but as teachers, prophets, visionaries. There are scattered reports, always from opponents of women claiming spiritual authority, of groups led by female figures who spoke of hidden knowledge and personal illumination. These are not coincidences. They are tremors from the gospel that bore Mary's name. Judas's gospel leaves a different trace, one colder, more difficult to pin down. You don't find many loving fan letters to Judas from the early centuries, but you do find groups whose theology aligns with his gospel's darker vision. The Sethians, for instance, described a false creator god who trapped souls in matter. They believed salvation came through knowledge of the divine realm beyond, and that most of the world, including religious authorities, served the wrong master. They didn't celebrate betrayal, but they didn't trust appearances either. There are hints in the writings of Irenaeus and Epiphanius bishops, committed to stamping out heresy of sects who believed in a Jesus that only appeared to suffer or who descended from realms beyond this world to awaken a few chosen souls. Some of them viewed the crucifixion not as redemptive suffering, but as cosmic strategy. Judas would have felt right at home. Even in the more orthodox writings of early Christianity, you catch glimpses of tension. The letters of Paul, for instance, often wrestle with factions claiming special knowledge, private revelations. Paul doesn't endorse them, but his frustration suggests that such movements were active, insistent, that there was more to the gospel than what the apostles were preaching publicly. And then there's the Gospel of John, canonical and poetic, but strangely echoing themes from Mary and Judas alike. A Jesus who speaks of being from above. a world that does not know him, a disciple whom Jesus loves more than the others, knowledge as eternal life. Could it be that even in the mainstream texts, shadows of the forbidden still flicker? These echoes don't prove that communities were directly following the Gospels of Mary or Judas, but they suggest that the ideas within those texts were alive, that the early church was not a single flame, but a wildfire with sparks catching in strange places. Some grew into accepted tradition, others were stomped out. Some still smolder unseen under layers of ash. There's a callback here to the earlier chapters on canon and censorship. We often imagine the church as moving cleanly from chaos to order, from fragmentation to unity. But the more we learn, the more it becomes clear unity was imposed, not inherited. And that imposition left behind ruins. Ruins where Mary's calm wisdom and Judas's harrowing insight still lingered, even if unacknowledged. And that leads to the question no council could ever fully answer: what if the heresies weren't failures, but paths? What if some early Christians followed Mary's model, seeking enlightenment through inward stillness, through visions and voice and the slow shedding of illusion? What if others felt Judas's shadow, not in glorifying betrayal, but in accepting that salvation might demand unthinkable action? What if the early church was not one story, but a collection of voices, some louder, some silenced, each trying to say the unsayable in their own way? The institutional record says no. But the archaeological record, the buried scrolls, the scattered letters, the angry heresiologists all say otherwise. And maybe that's what matters most. Not whether a formal church ever bore their names, but that their visions survived in whispers, in dreams, in the tremble between verses that feel just a little too strange. Because even now, long after their Gospels were buried, Mary and Judas are still being followed. Not in banners and pews, but in questions. And questions, after all, are where all revolutions begin. It's like oil and water, Mary and Judas. Two visions, two vocabularies, two entirely different spiritual weather systems barely inhabiting the same sky. And if the early church had tried to bring them both in, not as heresies, not as forbidden texts, but as sacred truths, the result wouldn't have been unity. It would have been fracture. Beautiful, dizzying fracture. Because you can't hold both in the same hand. Not really. Mary's gospel is centered on transformation through knowledge, but that knowledge is gentle, inward ascending. The soul learns. It sheds illusion. It speaks with calm authority. There's no war being waged, no cosmic betrayal to engineer. Salvation in Mary's telling is like slowly waking from a long sleep. Judas's gospel, on the other hand, is an earthquake. Salvation comes through rupture, the tearing apart of body and spirit, of illusion and design. It doesn't whisper. It cuts. Judas is chosen not because he sees gently, but because he acts decisively. He plays the villain to fulfill a plan that defies morality altogether. To put it plainly, Mary offers the map. Judas flips the table. Their underlying cosmologies are too different to reconcile. In Mary's gospel, the divine is accessible. The journey is upward. The soul is trapped, yes, but not in the dramatic fashion that Judas's gospel describes. The world, while flawed, is navigable. The powers she encounters can be named, reasoned with, outgrown. Judas's cosmos is merciless. The world isn't flawed, it's a counterfeit. The God most people worship isn't just mistaken for the true one, he's actively imprisoning them. Jesus, in this gospel, doesn't redeem the world. He escapes it. And Judas is the trapdoor. Put these visions side by side and you don't get harmony. You get dissonance. And yet both claim to be revelations from Jesus. Both claim to carry the secret teaching. Both present themselves not as fables, but as corrective lenses, the way to finally see the truth behind the myth. So whose Jesus is real? The early church answered that question with canon lists and bonfires. But before the flames, there was tension and silence. And very briefly, the chance that someone might have tried to hold both. What would that have looked like? Perhaps a Jesus who offers secret knowledge to Mary and cosmic instruction to Judas. A dual Messiah, one who teaches assent and one who embodies sacrifice. Perhaps the soul's journey through desire and wrath is not so different from the Gnostic escape from the archons. Maybe there is a sliver of overlap, a kind of mystical reconciliation that sees Judas's betrayal not as treachery, but as the final shedding of illusion. A necessary pain followed by Mary's healing vision. But that synthesis never happened. Because unity demands clarity. Doctrine demands borders. And these two gospels don't play well with boundaries. Mary's undermines hierarchy, particularly male leadership. Judas's undermines ritual sacrifice, even the sacraments. Neither leaves much room for a centralized institutional church. Their coexistence wouldn't have created a stronger theology. It would have birthed 1,000 interpretations. Fluid, decentralized, dangerous. And that's what makes their collision so profound. It isn't just about content, it's about power. About what kind of faith you want to build. Mary's gospel suggests a faith rooted in experience, deeply personal, often feminine, resistant to external authority. Judas's gospel demands a faith that sees beyond the veil, one that acknowledges suffering not as moral failure, but as part of an unbearable design. Both are threatening. For different reasons. There's a callback here to the earlier sections on canon formation, on buried manuscripts, on the politics of belief. The church didn't just exclude these gospels for their ideas. It excluded them because those ideas couldn't be contained. They wouldn't sit quietly next to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They'd argue with them, undermine them, rewrite the stage directions. Imagine reading Mary's gospel next to the book of Acts. Suddenly, Peter's authority doesn't seem so secure. Read Judas's gospel next to the passion narratives, and the betrayal looks less like sin and more like divine choreography. That's not coexistence. That's collapse. And yet the mere fact that we have both gospels, that they survived centuries of silence, is itself a kind of dialogue. One text speaks of assent, the other dissent. One of reconciliation, the other separation. Together they don't tell a cohesive story. They tell a story about the battle to tell the story. Maybe that's the real theological collision, not just between doctrines, but between methods of knowing, between the soul that remembers and the soul that must be broken open, between the whisper and the flame. So no, they could not coexist. But their incompatibility is what makes them matter. So let's take a breath. Let the smoke of centuries clear. And imagine for just a moment that things went differently. Imagine a Christianity where Mary's gospel and Judas's gospel weren't buried or burned, where they weren't labeled as heresy or silenced into oblivion, where their words were copied, taught, argued, and canonized, sitting not in some shattered jar in a desert cave, but on the same shelf as Matthew, Luke, Paul, and Revelation. How different would the faith look? Start with Mary. Had her gospel been preserved and embraced, you'd likely have seen a church with a radically different power structure. One less obsessed with apostolic succession and more attuned to spiritual insight. The idea that knowledge, not lineage, was the key to authority that would have been a crack in the marble floor of hierarchy. A crack through which women visionaries, mystics, could rise. Imagine sermons where the preacher doesn't shout about sin and salvation, but gently guides you through stages of soul ascension. where the fall isn't a punishment, but a forgetting. And the remedy isn't blood or obedience, it's remembrance, a return to what you already are. Now add Judas. If his gospel had endured not as a curiosity but as doctrine, the idea of sacrifice would have transformed. Not the Eucharist as reenactment of suffering, but as cosmic theater. Jesus doesn't die for our sins. In this telling, he dies because the system must be undone. And Judas, he's not damned but divinely commissioned. The one who activates the escape sequence. Christianity with both these visions might never have centered Rome. It might not have built cathedrals to authority. It may have leaned eastward toward Alexandria, toward metaphysics, toward a spirituality built not on uniformity, but on mystery. And what about worship? You wouldn't see so much blood on the altar. Instead, maybe candles lit for each layer of awakening. Chants not about guilt, but about memory. Baptism as a reminder, not a washing. Communion not of body and blood, but of light and breath. The split between clergy and laity might have blurred. Because if Mary's gospel teaches that true understanding lives within you, then why wait for someone in robes to grant it? And if Judas's gospel teaches that the world's structures are illusions, then what use is hierarchy? Even sin itself might have been redefined. Not as disobedience, but as ignorance. Not as something to punish, but something to heal. You'd still have disagreement, of course, maybe even more so. But the debates would be richer, less obsessed with who's in and who's out. Less about compliance, more about comprehension. And women, oh, the change would be seismic. Mary's presence as a true apostle, a voice equal to Peter's, might have opened floodgates. Female bishops in the 3rd century. Entire traditions of Christian mysticism built around feminine experience, not just appended to it, entirely plausible. As for Judas's role, it would remain uncomfortable. But maybe in that discomfort, there would be a deeper honesty, a willingness to admit that not all transformation is gentle, that sometimes liberation costs everything, that the path to truth doesn't always look like virtue. And perhaps this Christianity, this alternate inheritance, would have learned how to hold paradox, that Jesus can be both revealer and sacrifice, that salvation can come through stillness and rupture, that knowledge and surrender don't cancel each other out, they complete each other. Of course, there are reasons this didn't happen. Power politics, fear. But also, perhaps we weren't ready. Or maybe the church believed the people weren't. That holding these two gospels together was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too real. But now you've heard them. Both of them. You've walked with Mary through the veils of perception. You've followed Judas into the furnace of purpose. You've seen the world not just as it is, but as it could have been if only a few parchments had been spared, if only a few voices had been trusted. And that brings us here, to the edge of belief, to the question that no counsel can answer for you. If the Gospels of Mary and Judas had survived, would Christianity be stronger or stranger or just more honest? We can't know, but we can imagine. And sometimes imagination is the first act of resurrection. Section 24. The final weighing. Now it's just you, the silence, and two ancient scrolls, one bearing Mary's name, the other Judas's. Their edges cracked, their ink faded, but their voices intact. You've followed them through centuries of dust and doctrine, through fire and forgetting. And now, side by side, they ask the same question in different tongues. What does it mean to be saved? Mary's gospel hums like a breath held gently in the chest. Her salvation is an awakening, the lifting of fog, the remembrance of who you really are. The soul is layered, moving through desire, ignorance, wrath, and fear until it reaches peace. There's no blood price, no divine transaction, just you stepping slowly out of illusion and into light. Salvation isn't something done for you. It's something discovered within you. In contrast, Judas's gospel is a roar muffled behind a veil. His salvation is violent, cosmic, necessary. The world in his telling is a trap designed not by a benevolent creator, but by a lower being obsessed with control. Jesus, far from the gentle teacher of Mary's text, is the architect of a jailbreak. Judas is the trigger, the trusted betrayer who enables the plan. In this telling, salvation doesn't come through enlightenment. It comes through detonation. So which is true? If you listen closely, you'll hear echoes in both. Mary's voice is soft, but defiant, insistent that the truth is accessible without intermediaries. Judas's tale is harder, colder, but just as insistent that knowledge alone cannot undo the system without sacrifice. Mary offers a path of liberation through understanding. Judas offers a path through surrender to a higher, if brutal, logic. One vision gently dissolves the illusion, the other shatters it. And yet they're not opposites. Not entirely. Look again. Mary's journey begins with grief, the loss of her teacher, the hostility of the male disciples. Her path to clarity is hard-won. Judas, too, suffers isolation. He's set apart, despised, misunderstood, even by those who claim to know the plan. Both Gospels circle around the same fire, a world where the truth is dangerous, hidden, and revealed only to those willing to risk everything to see it. Perhaps that's the real answer, that salvation isn't a single path, but a convergence of sight and action. That inner clarity and external sacrifice are two halves of the same coin. Mary shows you the soul's quiet climb. Judas shows you the price of shaking the world awake. But here's the harder truth, the one no gospel can answer for you. You have to choose. Not which gospel to canonize or which ancient voice to believe, but which vision resonates deepest with your own shadows and hopes. Are you the seeker who waits in the quiet for the veil to lift? Or the one who sets the plan in motion, even knowing it might burn you down, Mary or Judas? Or both? Or neither? The early church made its choice, but you still have yours. The scrolls lie before you, cracked open like ribs around a heart, waiting, not for judgment, but for attention. So listen again. Whose gospel do you hear? Section 25. Letting the voices speak. Now the questions grow quieter. The scrolls are still. The voices, softer now, no longer demanding belief, just asking to be remembered. You've wandered through deserts and dust, through long-buried words and dangerous whispers. You've listened not just to Scripture, but to what lingers between the lines: grief, defiance, devotion, betrayal. And now you're here, at the edge of the story. So let it settle. Let Mary's voice return to you, calm, radiant, rising like light behind your eyelids. She doesn't argue. She doesn't plead. She only invites to look inward, to listen, to remember the truth you've always carried, that your soul isn't fallen, just clouded, that knowledge isn't forbidden, just feared. And then, Judas. A different kind of silence. Not peaceful but piercing. Not soft but sacred. His is the voice of the necessary wound. The one who walks away from comfort into chaos, not for reward, but for obedience to something larger. He reminds you that not all truth is gentle, and not all villains are wrong. These aren't just old stories. They are mirrors. They ask not for allegiance, but for reflection. Maybe in the end, the path to salvation was never meant to be universal. Maybe that's why the church buried one scroll and burned the other. Not because they were lies, but because they were too many truths, too complex, too free. So you choose, in quiet moments, in midnight questions, in the way your spirit leans toward light or leaps toward fire. Let the voices speak. Let them echo without fear. Let them belong to you again. And as you rest now, let the weight of centuries drift away. You are not in a church, not in a cave. You are somewhere between, somewhere holy, somewhere secret, somewhere still. Good night.